Well, it gives me great pleasure here in the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing to welcome Professor Peter Keller, who is an illustrious both musician, but I think foremost a master of groove and a master of many things. But I think we'll hear more about it today. But this kind of psychological and neurophysiological interactions is specifically about how it is that rhythm really makes us do things in the world. Yes. In a day-to-day, you've come from Australia, but you've now, and I'm very happy to say that you accepted the offer to come to Denmark to carry out the work at the Music in the Brain, which is sort of our sister organization with the center here in Oxford. And I think what I'm really excited about is I think one of the things that your work do is that it really connects the kinds of themes that we're interested here in the Eudaimonias Center, namely what is it really that makes us flourish, and what are the potentialities within music to make that happen? In parts of Africa, in Senegal, there's one of the main languages called Wolof, and in Wolof they say man is man's medicine. This idea that really in order to truly flourish we need other people, and what better way to do that is by making music with them. So please, Peter, we are really looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Morten, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here, and those online as well. And the introduction was perfect in terms of characterizing the topic, what I would like to share with you today, and look forward to discussion continuing afterwards. The title of the talk, Psychological and Neurophysiological Mechanisms for Human Interaction Through Music. Let's begin by considering the question, why do we engage in musical interaction? And one way to answer is to say that it is a medium for non-verbal communication, social bonding, and really seems optimized for cultural transmission, kind of at a higher level. And there are probably many potent examples one can draw on to illustrate how this works. And one that kind of sticks in my mind that I read about a while ago, and I'm sure many of you have heard about it as well, is the so-called Christmas truce. So this is going back some time, of course, to the First World War. Christmas 1914, the opposing British and German troops entrenched, started off a unusual type of volley exchange where one would sing a Christmas carol in their language and another would sing one in theirs. And eventually they stumbled upon one that they both knew and could sing simultaneously. And this precipitated them exiting the trenches, exchanging prisoners, exchanging gifts. You can see a Christmas tree in the picture, and even football games and so on. Of course, it didn't last and it didn't end up oh well, but that one brief moment created through interaction via music. And of course, then there are some maybe even a little bit more difficult to understand how that happened. Situations such as in 1977, when the Voyager spacecraft were launched, and they're still hurtling through interstellar space with unusual cargo, 2 golden records, and a lot of the information on these records is actually music. Number of music tracks, 27 of which are instances of music where one hears people playing together. And for those of you who haven't heard it, I've made a little compilation. So 27 tracks, just 1 second each. And there's been research showing that you can actually recognize genres of music and sometimes specific songs just from a few 100 milliseconds. So maybe you'll pick up some of these. Let's see if I can play it.
You may have to turn on the local sound on your machine.
Okay, so these were selected to kind of represent diversity in human creativity in communication, in the way we communicate. So it seems music can tell us a lot about what it means to be human. Now, what is it about this interaction? One thing that's been discussed quite a lot lately is how music has pro-social effects. When we engage with music in others, it promotes interpersonal bonding, feelings of affiliation, trust, cooperation. And in terms of what psychologists say is going on here, why are these effects potent? Why do they come about? There are several potential mechanisms. Could be attentional, directing attention to and enhancing representations of others with whom one's interacting, increasing the perceived similarity with somebody else. If you're doing things in time with them, they are more similar. And even a sense of self-other merging, a blurring of the boundary between where I am and where the others are. And this, of course, then creates powerful potential for using music in context. And this is why, one of the reasons why it's a important ingredient in a lot of rituals that have developed in different places around the world. And there are different functions that really music enhances. And two of them down the bottom, I'm highlighting courtship and promoting cohesion. So you can think of one side as kind of a competitive side, mate selection, competition, and the other cooperation in a group. And this will come back later towards the end of the talk in terms of relevance. Okay, so that's maybe some ideas about why we engage in music together. But what is it? What are we actually doing when we do that? And what I want to argue for the research that I'm presenting is that the rhythmic component is important. It's an instance of highly precise yet flexible rhythmic interpersonal coordination. And despite this, so humans generally have this ability, and they practice it in very elite forms, in social situations. It's diverse. It's diverse in the way we do it, the effectors we use, the type of genres of music they're engaged in, the type of dance, how much activity there is, whether it's pairs or larger groups. And there's also diversity at the individual level. Okay, our capacities for precise coordination can vary and are susceptible to plasticity effects with training. Now, the types of diversity, on one hand, I'm illustrating here variation across different musical styles and cultures. And I've put this on a kind of two-dimensional space. And you can see on the vertical axis, interpersonal coupling can vary from being very strong to weak. So if you're thinking about a tight you might talk about a tight rhythm section or a looser feel, and the degree to which sounds overlap, the actual synchrony between onsets of sounds. And the idea is that there are deliberate variations in this. If sounds aren't entirely synchronous, it doesn't mean that people cannot make them synchronous, but whatever's being conveyed in the music benefits somehow from some degree of asynchrony, and groove, which Morten mentioned, is one area where that seems to be an optimal zone of asynchrony, actually promotes that. And what we've done here is take measurements of these and plot different styles of music in this space. And the specific location in the space isn't important for now, but just to show you the different styles of music occupy this space in different ways. And then at the other end, we have individual differences. Even if we take somebody to the laboratory, and we do a lot of work, that's my colleague Bruno Rep, with finger tapping paradigms. So in the psychology lab, we try to reduce a complex behavior into a form where we control the different factors that are influencing it, to understand what's going on in terms of the underlying mechanisms. And one of the paradigms is just to tap a finger in time with a computer controlled sequence. And even that very simple task, you get people ranging from being just tens of milliseconds out to being hundreds of milliseconds out. And it's not really well understood why that's the case and what implications it have for interaction with others in music. So in order to get a leg up into this topic, I've been working with a theoretical framework, which I refer to as the ensemble skills framework. And it's based in cognitive psychology. And the argument is that at some level, we have sensory motor and cognitive skills that determine the quality of our coordination with others. And these are things that operate in real time, and they allow us to anticipate, to predict the timing of others, to engage in reactive error correction process. I call this temporal adaptation. And then to divide attention between what we're doing, the part we're playing in the interaction, and what others are doing, and the overall output. Okay, and these processes interact with one another, and they also interact with the performer's knowledge, whether you know the other person's part. If you're playing a piano duo, for example, have you played that other part? If it's another instrument, can you imagine what they're about to play next? Have you heard it before? Do you know how that person will play it? How slow or how quickly will they play it? Then goals and strategies. One can decide on leader-follower relationships. And then social factors. All of this is embedded in a social context. So factors such as personality can play a role in how the ensemble skills are applied. Now, one thing to note here, given the theme of the talk, is that these range, there's a whole gradient of levels that these traverse, from basic sensory motor processes to social and even cultural mechanisms. Okay, and another idea that we've been pursuing is that because of this sort of underlying psychology, music can be viewed as a microcosm. So the idea is that participating in collective musical activities draws on this spectrum of different processes: sensory, perceptual, cognitive, motor, and emotional. And these are the same processes that support other forms of social behavior that we engage in everyday life. And the interesting thing, and we argued this with some colleagues a few years ago, what this affords is music is an ideal domain to parametrically model the complexity of human social interaction. So at one end, you're going to have the experimental control, the finger tapping tasks and so on. And at the other end, real live interaction. There's more and more work going on these days in live performance situations with mobile technology for mobile EEG and motion capture and video and all sorts of sensors, also applied to the audience. And one can actually design paradigms to actually get at different levels across this spectrum. Okay, and it's easier to do that, one could argue, in music than with other sorts of activities. Okay, now, because of the social dimension, one process that has been a little bit understudied, perhaps, but I think deserving of more attention, is how interacting with others through music requires, it's a bit of a balancing act, balancing priorities regarding to self, my own priorities in my performance, getting my part right, and the relationship with what I'm doing and others are doing. And as part of my research, there's a qualitative dimension where I'm interested in what expert elite performers think they're doing when they're performing and what works and what doesn't work. And one quote that I'd like to share is from the trio Wanderer, French trio, where the pianist mentions that playing in a trio, in a piano trio, it's like a holy trinity. It's three individuals in a group, both things, and he emphasizes this, the individuality aspect and the group aspect are equal and very important. And he sees it as a sort of a mystical, mysterious thing. And, you know, as I mentioned before, from a psychology perspective, even though it's mysterious, we want to try to understand what's going on. And what I think is the idea, also going back to the pro-social effects of music, is there's a kind of simultaneous self-other merging and distinction that seems to be required for things to work right in terms of precise, flexible coordination. And there's an optimal balance. And this might vary depending on the context. So an idea that I've been working with is one that's been termed prioritized integrative attending. So one pays attention to your own part, to others' parts, and to the joint outcome, and the momentary demands, as you can see, these sliders on a mixer might adjust the balance a little bit. Sometimes it's more important to focus on what I'm doing and maybe not listen so much to others, but this can change during a performance. Okay, so although this is something that we've looked at very much in elite performers, in chamber musicians, in the Western tradition mainly, because this is convenient for us to access, although note that I did present that study where we collaborated with ethnomusicologists working in different cultures as well, and that's really a big goal. But for now, we've been focusing mainly on Western chamber music, but it does ask the question, what about, you know, if you pull somebody in from the Psychology 1 lecture and get them to do an experiment, is what we're studying with the musicians really relevant to other interaction? I argued at first that musical interaction is something that's kind of universal and we all can do or should do or might want to do. And so we did do a study. This is with former PhD student and then postdoc, and now he has successfully, having his own lab in Rome, Giacomo Novembre, developed these e-music boxes, we call them. It's a DJ Hero that's been repurposed so that you can play tunes, like a little music box where you rotate a lever and you play a tune. So you don't need specific music training in this. Kind of anyone can do it. You just have to rotate with a constant rotational frequency, and the rhythm of the tune is programmed to come out right. And in this particular experiment, we have two people playing together, and in one condition they can see each other. And what we vary, however, is the pitch separation between what each of them is producing. It's either the same pitch, okay, or it's several octaves apart. And the idea is when it's same pitch, by a basic phenomenon of auditory streaming, the sounds are occurring in a single stream. And if they're in time, they can actually, it's hard to know who's who. You can lose track of this, sort of loss of sense of agency in a sense. Whereas if it's separate, it's then quite easy to, it's segregated in two separate streams, and it's very easy to tell who's who. And what we also vary, however, this is tricky, and this is the point of this device, you can program it so that in order to play in time, people have to at the same rate, at the same rate, or you can program it that one has to rotate at a different rate to the other, and we actually do that in a complex ratio of 3 to 4, so it's actually impossible to intentionally do, and we force people to watch each other, force as in the task is set up that it's hard not to watch each other if you keep your eyes open, and we monitor that. And there, what we're interested in is what effect do these types of compatibility between the movement and the sounds have. And it turns out, this is a bit of a complex graph, don't worry too much, we're looking at the asynchrony between the tones that they're producing, and by the way, they're playing a familiar tune, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and we have a condition where the sounds are the same, the sounds are different, and the movements are the same, and the movements are different. This is a crossed 2x2 design, and the asynchronies are larger when you have same sounds and different sounds, and larger when you have different movements than same movements, and there's a so-called interaction. And the bottom line, in the bottom row, in fact, is that they're at best. So the asynchrony is lowest throughout the trial for all the participants, participant pairs, when you have different sounds, so you can tell who's who, and the movements are the same. So you're segregated in the auditory modality and integrated in the visual. And in all the other conditions, they drift apart. And these are seconds. It's obscene, like 5 seconds apart at the end. And it's deliberately a task where it's actually hard to do under certain conditions. So this shows how simultaneous segregation and integration of self and other is important even in a very basic task, not necessarily elite music performance. Okay, so how do we understand what's going on? And where I'm going with this is really try to understand not just at a descriptive level what might be going on, but then get to the neurophysiological level and actually see what's going on in the brain that is producing such effects. And in order to bridge that gap, if you like, we use a computational modeling approach, and we've called it ADAM. It stands for Adaptation and Anticipation Model, and it actually stems from these 3 ensemble skills. And you'll see there are 3 colored boxes there. There's an adaptation module, there's an anticipation module, and a joint module, which is actually attentional. And I won't go through in too much detail for this particular talk, but essentially the adaptation module engages in 2 reactive error correction processes. It monitors asynchronies between one's own sounds and other sounds, and estimates a proportion of that, and can adjust the timing of upcoming movements based on the error. Then an anticipation module, that's kind of a temporal prediction module. So it's monitoring the other sounds and looking at extrapolating. So if the intervals are getting shorter, that means things are getting faster. When would the next event occur? And it computes that. And then there's a second process, which we call perseveration, which is just copying the previous interval, just mimicking the previous interval. And we have a parameter that weights those 2 processes. So you're either predicting or copying or something in between. And then those feed into internal models of self and others. So the self model engages in action planning. It plans, okay, if I'm going to make this next action at this time, what will happen? What will the effect be? And the other model is, if this person carries what I think they're going to do, what would the effect be? And then this is in the future, anticipatory computes a discrepancy that might occur if I were to do what I planned when the other person did what they were predicting. And there's a mechanism to correct this in advance. So this sounds computationally expensive, but we've shown that actually under some conditions, this model, even accounting for the extra parameters, does provide a good fit to behavioral data. And the thing to point out is that this joint internal model, we're conceptualizing that as the parameter that controls that anticipatory correction is the proportion of attention to self versus others. So this is where the self-other integration and segregation process takes place in the model. Now, don't worry too much about the details, but the point is that from a time series of behavior collected in tasks, drumming with another human partner or interacting with a computer, you can estimate for each individual that does the experiment from the time series these parameters and look at that in terms of explaining individual differences in their coordination skills, in their ensemble skills. And the type of tasks we do to assess adaptation and anticipation involve, as I said before, finger tapping in time with a metronome. So long as the metronome is steady, a process of phase correction. So we're assuming that there's a timekeeper or oscillator guiding a person's movements, and the phase of that can change. If I'm early, I'll adjust it so that the next event I produce is a little bit later. But the overall tempo, the timekeeper period, can stay the same. However, if there's a change in the tempo, if the other person suddenly gets twice as fast or twice as slow, I need to change the period of timekeeper or use another oscillator from a bank of oscillators. And there are these 2 processes, and we've shown in other work using a dual task where people, while they're tapping, have to do mental arithmetic, and we can estimate phase correction and period correction. We know from that work that period correction is effortful. It requires attention, whereas phase correction is automatic. Okay, that's one side of things. The other side is the anticipation. So predicting what, how and when for others' actions. Walking around with Morton the other day, I was constantly reminded that I shouldn't ask why, I should ask when. So in Oxford, this seems very pertinent that we are actually interested in when with this model, the when of others' actions. So we use a task where people tap along with a external sequence controlled by a computer that is programmed to get progressively slower and faster, like expressively timed music. And people tap along with it, and then we can use a modeling procedure to estimate how much people are extrapolating the changes in tempo versus just copying the previous interval. In terms of ecological validity, we find if we do this in one session and then bring people into the lab and pair together people who were predicting tempo changes quite well, and other people who tend to just mimic the previous interval and not engage in much active prediction. When we pair them together, we find that pairs of predictors are better in sync with one another, and the pairs of what we call trackers aren't so well in sync, and mixed pairs are kind of in the middle. Okay, so what I want to present now is a large-scale functional magnetic resonance imaging study where we were interested in individual differences in sensory motor synchronization and using our model to decompose this into these different components, the different boxes I was showing you, and the different parameters, and then see if we can identify networks in the brain that map onto those particular parameters. So we had 75 participants and varying levels of musical experience. And the two synchronization tasks were essentially the ones I described before, the regular tempo task, but where, in this case, the computer is a virtual partner. So we've implemented the model in the computer to actually engage in phase correction in a couple of conditions. So either just a dumb metronome, just a steady metronome, or it's actually correcting, it's monitoring asynchronies as the human participant taps along and correcting for a proportion of that. And the only reason why we do that in this study is to assess performance under conditions of different types of partners you might meet in real life. Some will be more reactive and some won't, okay? And then the second task is this tempo changing task where the sequence starts steady and then gets faster, slower. And we have, of course, a number of different trials with different tempo changing profiles. When we look, we apply the model to the behavioral data, and we find, of course, people vary in how much adaptation. So here's a little mini histogram showing some individual variation in the adaptation parameters, the anticipation parameter, and the joint parameter. And this predicts the overall asynchrony when they're doing these tasks. The details aren't too important here if you take my word for it. What's more interesting, I think, is then we have people doing this in the MRI scanner. We're recording functional data, and then we use a technique, connectome-based predictive modeling. It's an extension of correlational psychophysiological interactions analysis to look at task-related changes in functional connectivity in different brain networks. And this is what I'll tell you a bit of more detail now. I won't go too much into the background. Some of you will know about brain resting state networks. So intrinsic networks in the brain, if you get somebody to lie in the scanner and don't give them a particular task to do and measure the correlation between activity across different brain regions, what emerges are certain areas that become more positively or negatively correlated with one another or uncorrelated. And when you sort through all this, you identify a number of resting state networks, okay? And you can do this with different sorts of parcellations and end up with different numbers of networks. We're using a solution with 7 main resting state networks and some subnetworks within those. And because we're interested in the timing task, if any of you have looked in the sensory motor synchronization or movement control literature, you know that actually a lot of the action is happening subcortically. Basal ganglia, cerebellum, and thalamus. So we also look at connectivity within those subcortical regions, not just the cerebral cortical regions. And now I'm going to show you 3 slides that show some main results. And again, the details are not important. What is the point is to show that what we're extracting are different profiles, okay, different types of neural architecture in the brain that identify with individual differences in different behavioral parameters. For phase correction, so the reactive error correction in the adaptation module, the automatic process, the effortful process of period correction, the stimulus prediction, and the anticipatory error correction. Encoded in red are positive changes. So if people are high on, for example, phase correction, they will have higher or increased functional connectivity in the red coded regions. And if people are low, they'll have high activity in the blue regions there. Okay, and you can see the cerebellar involvement here, and here basal ganglia and thalamus. Okay, so that as I said, the details aren't too important, just that we can extract functional connectivity in the brain that is correlated with behavioral parameters. And here we see a little bit more detail. If you're concerned, well, surely anything would come out from such a complex analysis. We get chance level estimates and these faded circles here. And then the filled in colors here are the proportion of hub regions within each resting state network. So each resting state network comprises several regions. And these are the subcortical networks, and then all the cortical resting state networks. And again, the main point is the positive in red and negative in blue. Some of these exceed the chance level estimates. And the point is that these profiles differ across the networks. And then the final slide, where the details aren't too important, is this one here, where now we're looking at a number of connections within and between resting state networks, not just the number of hubs, like how much there is, but how they're actually connected. And the ones that are outside the circle are within. So for example, this one here is that in phase correction, you get relatively strong positive correlation within the network cerebellum, but the cerebellum is also connected to the somatomotor and the ventral attention network, for example. Okay, and again, these profiles are very, very different. And the final slide, where now the details are maybe a little bit more important, shows atom network connectivity profiles. So here, how each network recruits the resting state networks. And now it's a little bit, I think, easier to compare. So if you look at the colored rows for now, all I want you to see is that for phase correction, period correction, stimulus prediction, and anticipatory correction, we've got the edges refers to connections in this lingo. So the percentage of total edges, and the total edges in the default mode network, the control network, dorsal attention, and ventral attention salience network. Don't worry too much about what these are for now. But what I want you to maybe take note of is that, for example, you see these relationships that pop out. For example, that the phase correction and the period correction are kind of mirror inverse of one another. And if you look most closely at the default mode network, for example, is high positive correlation for the period, but not for the phase correction. You get a different picture for stimulus prediction and a different picture for joint, anticipatory error correction, but you also see similarity, which suggests that these might be working together. And I'm pointing to now the period correction and the joint anticipatory correction have a similar type of profile if you look at the colored shading. Okay, why is this important? It suggests that these networks are working together, and they kind of must be because it's predicting behavior. It's correlated with parameters that predict behavior. And we want to know, okay, this sort of goal that we're looking for is what's the network, the common ground where all this interaction is taking place. So here, we identify what can be called, we don't do it technically, maybe the rich club analysis, but it's like a rich club, it's like common nodes across these networks. For those who care about details, I've listed them there, but again, you don't need to read this. What you can see shaded are those common things. So these are regions that you would have seen on those blue and red plots before, but now the ones where it's common. And this is where really the regulation between networks in relation to the parameters is happening. And this is where we think this joint module is really, really coming into play and controlling the dynamics of the interaction. Now, why this is important is because, as I mentioned before, the precise and flexible coordination that we can achieve behaviorally requires the brain to really change its state. So this concept of criticality, sort of being between states, and metastability, being able to change states flexibly. And we think this is the network that's probably controlling that in this type of context. And what it's enabling is the degree to which internal and external information is kept separate or integrated, segregated or integrated, to be controlled in a manner that allows us to coordinate. So I've said something about some theory, and I've talked about a computational model, and I've said something about how we approach looking at in the brain, how this might be playing out. And now that we've got this system in place, I want to see what sorts of activity, how does it come to play and come to bear in various sort of contexts. If we go one step closer to real behavior and look at a different domain. So one study I'll present, and this will be kind of just one slide each, on how this sort of processes are affected by the cooperativity of the other partner, the expertise of the person synchronizing. And actually, it's maybe going to be interesting here because the expertise group we're interested in are shamans. Neuromodulation. Okay, you're not an expert, but can we use non-invasive brain stimulation to change your brain states in a way that affect your coordination? As, for example, clinical applications potentially. Then knowledge. This is something that's not so well known. For example, if you're playing a piece with somebody and you've either practiced their part before or not, how does that affect what's going on in terms of the interaction at the level of brain and behavior? and your goals and intention. Do you both plan to play faster or slower at the same time? Beliefs, if you believe that it's another human or a computer, for example, has implications for human-machine interaction with social robotics. And personality, how are these processes affected by, well, I know there's interest here in things such as empathy, and we're interested in other dimensions as well. And then when you put things in a real social context, how do what's present in that context, the characteristics of that context, affect what you do? Okay, so partner cooperativity. This is a study done with Merle Fairhurst-Menon, and this is a while ago in Leipzig. And we used our virtual synchronization partner to set things up where, as I mentioned before, these are the conditions across the horizontal axis: 0 adaptivity, just a dumb metronome, and then various degrees, correcting for a quarter of the error, half the errors being the asynchronies, and 0.75 and 1. And what you see here, it's not an inverted U, but it's a U, where this is kind of interesting. This is the standard deviation of asynchrony between the two. And you'd think, oh, maybe if the computer is correcting for 100% of the error, that's a good thing. But remember, phase correction in the human is automatic. So they're kind of missing each other at that point. It's overcorrection when you sum them. Okay, so the optimal situation is where it's a moderate amount of error correction. That's behaviorally. And what we were quite excited about, and this kind of started in a way, this whole quest for looking at what's happening in the brain in terms of relationship between different networks. This wasn't a connectivity study. This was just looking at the amount of functional activation across these conditions, like just a subtraction contrast. And when we have the conditions which are in the green zone here, when coordination is good, you get these regions that, and coordination is automatic, that favors integration. And, you know, if you engage in a bit of reverse inference, social affective and self-referential processing, but we now know from our other work that this is really very much the case of these hub regions, rich club regions that are involved in interacting with the default mode network. And then, or as part of the default mode network. And then as soon as you get out of that, even though it's a few milliseconds different in terms of the interaction, really not much to write home about, you get this large-scale shift to right lateralized control network regions. Okay, so that's what actually got us interested in what's happening, what's flipping this. Seems that very subtle changes in the degree of cooperative of the partner enough to do this. Okay, now in terms of expertise, this is another thing that got us interested because we found something here that seemed to be an unusual way in which different networks were coupled together with one another. So this is a study with shamans, and this was led by Mike Hove, who's now at Fitchburg State University in the US, but was a postdoc in the group. He's big on groove, one of the early pioneers in groove research as well. And also, it turns out, big on trance, altered states of consciousness, absorptive states of consciousness, and had an idea to study what's going on, and rhythm, and that's where groove comes into it, in terms of shamanic trance and journeying, but specifically the role of rhythmic drumming in that. Because so shamanic traditions have developed all over the world independently, and it seems they have a lot of similarities, and one of those is a regular drum beat that helps to induce the trance state. And that's something that's typically around 4 hertz, like a boom, 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 boom. You can listen to recordings online. And what we decided to do, and this was, as I said, Mike and Johannes Stelzer mainly working on this. Get some shamans. It's super easy to do, of course, trivial. Get 14 shamans and bring them to Leipzig and put them in the MRI scanner, record EEG simultaneously, well, of course, and look at what's going. And this was kind of a study where it was like resting state, these 8-minute scans, but they did kind of have a task. In one condition, the task was to go on a journey through the different levels of worlds. And then the other task was not to trance, okay? So that was more like the conventional resting state, but there we had a stimulus as well, which was the drumming that they were familiar with, and they weren't drumming, by the way, they were listening to recordings of drumming, where the jitter, the natural jitter, had been amplified by a certain amount, which they reported to us beforehand, and we piloted. They couldn't trance with that. It was like, don't mess with me. I can't get in the zone. So we didn't want them to trance, but we wanted still auditory stimulation because we wanted some element of control. Anyway, the main thing that we found when we looked at where connectivity was stronger was that if we look at posterior cingulate, this is a default mode region. So this came up in our previous analysis as well. And we look at that as a seed region, what it's connected to more strongly for trans and non-trans. And again, we find some regions that are, again, part of this control network. So what they're doing in that other task with cooperativity, people are either upregulating one and down-regulating the other, depending on cooperativity. Here, the shamans are actually upregulating both these networks at the same time. And what we argued in the paper was that what they're actually doing is using their control network to focus inwards on the brain's internal dynamics, and that's leading to the sort of insight that they have. Okay, so usually the processes involved in monitoring and making decisions and so on is actually focused inwards. And one thing that adds to that explanation, potential interpretation of the results, is that when we look at connectivity between very early auditory regions and auditory cortex, we find a decoupling. So because the brain is so predictive, the rhythm is so predictable in the drumming, and we know that the brain, in terms of predictive coding, is maybe not so interested in that. It's interested when there's a prediction error. So they're kind of tuning out from the external, but using the brain systems that would usually focus on external information to focus internally. So this is a really high-level expertise, and one could argue that some conditions of music making require that sort of skill as well. Okay, but we're not all experts, we're not all shamans. Can we do anything to change the way we coordinate through some sort of intervention? And this is actually going back to Giacomo now. This was a transcranial alternating current stimulation study where you pass current through the brain from an anodal to cathodal electrode. And the neat thing about this particular technique is you can control the frequency and the phase of the signal that you're passing through the brain, and thereby kind of drive brain oscillations in a pretty crude way. But it turns out enough to actually modify behavior. So we do this with two people together, and the task is, I haven't got a picture of it, but they're asked to just start tapping together. They hear they get a go signal, and they have to start tapping and tap in sync for 8 or 12 beats. And we start the stimulation shortly before that, and it's either in phase, so the current is passed either in phase or in anti-phase, and at 3 different frequencies. They're asked to tap at 2 hertz, so 2 beats per second, 10 hertz, so the alpha rhythm, which is the dominant rhythm in the brain, and it comes up in studies of social cognition a lot, but also in a lot of other stuff too. And then more specifically, beta frequency, 20 hertz, which in motor preparation and motor planning is an important frequency. Okay, and what we find, and I'm not showing all the results, just the main one, is we have a measure of behavioral synchrony, and we're interested how the stimulation protocol affects that. And the way to read this graph is the blue is for in-phase stimulation, and this is now just the 20 hertz, okay? And the red is anti-phase stimulation. And lower values mean more in sync. This is a baseline, so it doesn't mean 0 as in zero asynchrony. It means that you're better than the baseline here. And what you see is this effect that starts, and it washes out because automatic error correction comes in. So at least at the start, one can modulate it. It's quite a subtle effect, but it shows that these effects are modifiable and could be maybe built on. Okay, so that was about the more basic kind of stuff. And now let's get more outside the sensory motor domain to the more cognitive domain and look at goals and knowledge. So I gave the example before of a piano duo. So we've done quite a bit of work bringing pianists to the lab. Often we get them to prepare beforehand. We send them the pieces to practice. And when they get to the lab, we have 2 pianos set up, in this case in separate rooms, and we can record EEG from them simultaneously as they play, and record their performances as well on electronic keyboards, MIDI keyboards. Now, in this particular study, we're manipulating their knowledge and their goals. And by how we operationalize that, by knowledge, we mean whether they're familiar or unfamiliar with the other's part. More concretely, whether we sent them this unfamiliar music. They're actually Bach chorales, but just the soprano and bass line, and these people didn't really know them. And they either get both parts or just one part. And they get a little bit of time to practice it, they memorize it, and then they come into the lab and we test whether they can do it. But there was another trick. We sent them recordings of the parts they had to learn at different tempi, and we asked them to learn them at those specific tempi. But then when they came to the lab, we gave them cues. I haven't really shown the whole task, but you see this red and green arrow. They were told to play 2 phrases, and there was a silent pause in the middle. And they were told to play the first phrase at 120 beats per minute. So again, 2 hertz, and then pause for 2 bars, and then start playing the next phrase, either faster or slower, 96 or 150 beats per minute. But because there was an experiment and they're in separate rooms looking at a monitor, we could either give them the same cue, like both of you should get faster, or both of you get slower, or we could give them incongruent. Tell one person to get faster and the other slower. And what we did was we cut the sound during the pause, so they didn't actually know this was going on. And what we're interested in for this particular experiment is just what happens in the first phrase. Now, it turns out, if you know the co-articulation effect, like what you're about to say in the future influences how you say something in the present, the same thing happens in music. If you're planning to play, at least in this context, the second phrase faster or slower, I didn't do anything. There's a shaman somewhere.
I think you may just turn your sound off.
Okay. So, as I was saying, when you're going to play the second phrase faster or slower, influences already slightly how you play the first phrase. It's only a few milliseconds effect. Okay, but if you're going to get faster, you play the first phrase already. You anticipate that a bit. So, I'm not going to show all the details of this study, of course, but the most interesting finding, we're recording EEG, and this isn't a study where we're looking at the relationship between what's going on across the brains, by the way. This is just looking at power in a particular frequency band, and here we're interested in alpha power, and we're interested in what reflects an interesting interaction that we found in behavior. So the interaction specifically of the knowledge and goal factor, so the tempo versus familiarity. So here you can see alpha power in the familiar condition versus unfamiliar, and then for congruent, tempi, for the second phrase, and this is all just for the first phrase that we're analyzing, or incongruent. And what you can see is this difference is only in the familiar case. So the idea here is that when you're familiar with the other person's part, if they're playing slightly out of sync with you, you kind of tune out. So this is balancing this internal versus external focus. And we see, kind of identify where that's expressed in EEG brain activity. And the idea is that self-other segregation, which is related to alpha enhancement, as it turns out, when goals are incongruent, and self-other integration, so alpha suppression, when goals are congruent. But that's only when you're familiar with the other part. So really, familiarity with what another person is doing in an interaction will affect how much you process and what you do with the information they provide. Okay, so that's because the EEG is really measuring, we didn't do self-localization in that, we had a very sparse montage, but we're based on other data we have, we think that's really the sort of a very kind of peripheral cortical type effect. But as we mentioned before, what's going on subcortically, and especially the cerebellum in terms of internal modeling, is a really key area. So we went a bit further, we dug a bit deeper, and Natalie Köhler and co did a study. This was in Leipzig, where the piano manufacturer Blüthner is based, right? And they came on board to build, what you find if you do MRI studies with musicians, they like complaining if you give them a little keyboard with 1 octave with plastic keys that's kind of compatible, or an unusual instrument. So the colleagues in Leipzig had the idea, let's go to Blüthner and get them to build something with weighted keys. It's still only 2 octaves or whatever. It's in a nice box. It's all, of course, the electronics are done in such a way that it's scanner compatible. But we didn't get any complaints. It was a kind of tough task, because here you see one person in the scanner, and it was a piano duo study. So there's another person outside the scanner, and they're playing together in real time. But of course, we're just recording from one at a time in this case. Okay, and again, we are interested in this interaction of knowledge and congruency. So it's the same behavioral paradigm, but where do we find some effective modulation of this brain activity based on this interaction? And there we actually get a region neighboring the one that we found in that connectivity study that I started with, in terms of one of the atom-rich club regions. And what's even more interesting, again, it's expressed in this interaction between familiarity of the other part, whether you've practiced it, and the congruency of the goal. And you see that the correlation between the activity in this particular cerebellar region is correlated with the familiarity with the pieces. Okay, with actually a behavioral measure of mutual adaptation. Okay. So here's the correspondence between the areas. So we think we've kind of identified the locus of the joint internal model at the cerebellar level. There's more going on and these paradigms not necessarily sensitive to everything. Okay, so what about a situation where you might know what the other person's doing, but for whatever reason, they're doing it in a different way you might expect? So here we did another kind of sneaky manipulation where we gave people scores and told one person gave expressive tempo markings to player one to play the first phrase slower and then the second phrase faster, and gave either the same, of course, in a congruent condition, or the opposite tempo markings to the other player. So that person will be getting fun. And this is obvious. Now they can hear each other. And we were just interested. We put somebody in that situation, pair of people. What do they do? And we tell them, don't talk about it. Just pretend it's a performance and you can't talk. How do you get through it? Like, what are you going to do? So by the way, we assessed personality and thought we might be able to predict who's going to do what based on that, and we didn't have a large enough sample to do that. But nonetheless, we found something interesting, partly expected. So for example, this is the asynchronies, inter-keystroke asynchronies between the two players as a function of performance numbers. So we asked them to repeat the performance several times, and we were looking at how they'll change it as they resolve this by a process of non-verbal negotiation. And of course, they get more in sync, but they're always better in the congruent condition than the incongruent. But something's happening. Something's changing. What are they doing? This is a bit of a hairy plot to look at, but basically what it shows here on the horizontal axis is the correlation between the keystrokes of the pianist versus what they would be playing if they were playing the score correctly. So we kind of just compute what the tempo should be at each note. So higher correlation means they're actually playing what we're telling them to play. And then here's the correlation between the two pianists. Okay, and what you can see, the only thing to take away from this is the intersection point of this horizontal line is pretty much the same in these two conditions. One of them is when it's congruent tempi or incongruent, but this vertical line shifts, where in the congruent condition, there's some degree to which the person's, people playing what's in their score, but they're prioritizing interacting with the other person, which is kind of the task, but they abandon their score when the other person is wrong. So that is out of sync. So that seems to be showing there's some sort of negotiation, and it's more shifting and prioritizing, coordinating with the other, the joint outcome, if you like, and integration. Okay, so now the final level is how do social factors potentially affect this type of interaction? And one of them is social beliefs. So, I mean, there is a bit of discussion and a bit of research on what happens. Does it make a difference when you're interacting with a non-human agent, a robot, say? How do we increase trust with that agent if you want somebody to comply with what they're doing, or to enjoy and value the interaction, be motivated to pursue it? But one aspect is just we're interested, does it really make a difference even at this sensory modal level? Most of the tasks, I think, are a little bit more decision-making tasks or happening at a different time scale. In this case, we're talking about this tens of milliseconds precision. Does it make a difference to the processes we're interested in the type of modeling approach? So here, Peter Mills, who was a PhD student, did a study where people came in, again, separate rooms, and here it's a drumming task. So they're hitting a MIDI percussion pad with a stick. Participants really prefer that. Incidentally, we started doing this when we were working with patients, with stroke patients and others who maybe weren't generating sufficient force or weren't doing that reliably, and they enjoyed being given a stick. Gravity helps, and we found out that actually first-year psychology students are pretty much the same. They complain about having the force required to tap on a pad, which musicians don't usually have a problem with. But we've carried the drumstick over, and in this case, we have two people coming into the lab together, and we introduce them, and they do a bit of a practice session, play a bit of a game together, and then we put them in their separate booths and control an experiment. And what we vary, they're synchronizing, and it's actually the virtual partner who I introduce you to for the whole experiment. But we tell them that it's the other person in some trials, and tell them that it's a computer in the other trials, which is what it always is actually. And what we do is that we measure the degree of synchrony between the person and the computer, and they're both doing the task at the same time. It's a good way to get a large amount of data. And so what we find, we also, after the experiment, after they come out, we ask them, okay, which did you prefer, interacting with the other participant or the computer? Like, which one went better? And they tell us, and then afterwards we say, we test whether they believe the manipulation, and most of them did. I think there were 3 out of 50 or whatever who maybe didn't and suspected that there was something going on. Okay, so, and what we find, however, and this wasn't entirely expected, was that the preference, whether you say you prefer interacting with a computer or a human, is related to how well you actually do at the task. Now, why this is interesting is because it's always a computer. So your preference, it's really something, and it's a bit of a chicken egg situation. We've done experiments to try to sort it out, and it's a bit more convoluted story. But just for now, it's just look at this profile. So if you say afterwards that you preferred it when it was a human, which is just you believed it was a human, then actually your asynchrony is lower when you're instructed that it's a human. And then when you say you did better with a computer, so people would seem to be sensitive to how they're doing, but why they're doing that, this experiment doesn't tell us. But what the point is here, when we do the modeling, use our ADAM model and get estimates of adaptation, error correction, anticipation, and the joint process, integrating self and other, it's the profile for the joint model. So when you integrate more with the partner you prefer, okay? Okay, and now how does personality affect all this? So the first study we did, and this was again Merle, this was a while ago, we used our virtual partner, but we added a twist where rather than just phase correction, where it produces a steady tempo, we imbue it with period correction, which means it can change its timekeeper. It can drift, into the region of languid, slow. It can get infinitely slower or infinitely faster, and it's up to the participant to keep things on track. So it's a two-part instruction. We say, please synchronize with and we tell them it's a virtual partner in this case, but also, it's a bit unstable in places, so maintain tempo. And we're interested in how people prioritize those two instructions, okay? And we assess locus of control. So locus of control refers to whether you attribute life events to external or internal causes. So if you fail an exam and you're internal, you'll say, maybe I failed the exam because I'm stupid or I didn't study enough. And if you're external, you say, well, I failed the exam because the professor didn't prepare us and was a bad teacher. Okay, so it shouldn't necessarily have much to do with what's going on at this millisecond timescale, but it turns out that it does. And when we estimate how much people are adapting to the virtual partners that are unstable, we find that people who are internal of locus of control, they are adapting less. So they're prioritizing maintaining the tempo and taking responsibility for it, whereas the external are kind of going with the flow, and actually the coordination suffers as a result. And we call those leaders and followers for other reasons. This was actually an MRI study as well done in the scanner, and there we find stronger activation in leaders in brain regions involved in self-monitoring. Okay, so that's again evidence of internal focus and consistent with the previous results. Okay, finally, empathy, temporal prediction in specifically relation to empathy. So again, we do this task with a tempo changing sequence in the scanner. This was again quite a few years ago, and we went again looking at functional connectivity, just looking at activity and loosely looking at what sort of networks come out, and they can be identified with integrating sensory motor information, action simulation, so using the brain's motor system. In this case, we assume to generate predictions about auditory events, so as if you're producing the actions yourself to some degree, and social cognitive processes. And I've tried to color code these, and the green ones are what of interest. So again, if a bit of reverse inference is permitting, but we've followed this up, there's quite a striking overlap between those regions and those studies found in empathy. Okay, the green regions here and here. But this is, of course, MRI, a correlational method. And as I said, we're relying on reverse inference. So what if we go a bit further and again go to non-invasive brain stimulation? And again, this is now a transcranial magnetic stimulation study where we're sending, in this case, double pulses at a very specific point while people are synchronizing with a recording. So it's a virtual piano duo situation. And we send double pulses to disrupt processing in the motor system, contralateral to the hand. So they're playing with their right hand, and the part they're listening to and synchronizing with is the left hand, the baseline of what they're playing. And there's a tempo change at a certain point, and we send a double pulse to their right motor cortex, which should interfere with processing related to the left hand. We're assuming they're simulating the other part with their left hand, and this is going to knock them out and maybe affect how well they can update their predictions to keep in time with the tempo change. And we find that there is a disruption. We've assessed people's empathy as well, and perspective taking in particular, and we find that that's correlated with the degree of disruption. So people who are high in empathy and perspective taking rely on this network to generate predictions. And when you deny it to them by knocking it out briefly, their predictions are disrupted. And then another experimental approach to get at this is where we assess people's perspective taking before they come to the lab, and then we pair them up as high perspective taking pairs and low, and get them to do the music box task together. So this is, again, people now without any specific music experience, and measure their synchrony between them. And we find that the high empathy pairs are better at producing sounds in sync than the low. And when we do an analysis to look at leader-follower relations, we find that it's the high empathy pairs aren't doing anything different. But what happens is that the low empathy people are better predicting when you give leader-follower roles, which I didn't mention, but we give them leader-follower roles. And when you're high empathy or low empathy, it doesn't affect what you do as a leader. You perform more regularly to help the other person coordinate, but the follower is better able to use that information. So they're better able to generate predictions if they're high empathy. Okay, so finally, am I okay? Hopefully I'm okay for one final study, social context. Where this gets into evolutionary territory. Okay, it's often been observed that the other species produce music-like behavior, and there it's sometimes thought to be a bit more transparent in terms of functions in mate choice, pair bonding, territorial functions, and group cohesion. And some species that maybe have received less attention until very recently are collectively signaling. Things such as fireflies. I noticed there was a picture downstairs, so maybe there's some interest in that phenomenon here. Fiddler crabs, so Australians are interested in that. They have this one oversized claw, which they wave together. And of course, crickets and cicadas, doing it in the auditory modality, and certain frogs as well. Now, in a lot of these cases, it's males doing it to attract migrating females, and collectively doing it sends a kind of beacon effect. Okay, and in the sound, in the chorusing insects, it's an amplitude summation effect. It carries further. But actually, what's going on when you look at the modeling and talk to the biologists about it, it's actually driven by competitive. They're trying to mask each other's signals in a way, at least in terms of the auditory, because it's a mechanism where if you produce sounds earlier, so precedence or prominence, louder, you tend to mask the other sounds, but it also triggers sounds in the others, and this way it builds up into a chorus. Now, we were interested in whether that's at all related to what happens in some odd phenomena that were reported in choral singing. Now, Oxford, again, another thing I got to enjoy while I was here was some excellent choral singing. And I guess you people don't really have to think about people in Leipzig, but there's a not too shabby choir in Leipzig as well, the St. Thomas choir, which Johann Sebastian Bach was one of the Kapellmeisters a while ago, and it's been going a long time as well. And we had the opportunity to work with them. So we conducted a study where we maybe this needs a bit of a background because otherwise it just sounds quite odd. But we introduced females into the audience at a certain point during a concert performance, and we're interested in what effect would have on the boys' voices. Now, why did we do that? It's kind of a bit odd thing to do. It's because our middle author there, Rasmus Koenig, was a former chorister. And he told us that there was this thing with the Kapellmeister, not Bach, many generations later, something would happen in certain performances when there were girls there, and nobody. It's a boys' choir, of course, and it's not as progressive as many I've seen here, where actually girls are allowed. And I don't know when that's going to change, but for whatever it is, that's the way it is now. And something would happen, and the Kapellmeister would be very annoyed, but nobody knew what it was. And I've tried to find out historically how far this goes back, but in any case, that's what anecdotally we were told. So we did this study, and we thought, well, what can they be doing? I mean, either it's nothing, or nothing that we can detect, or they're not going to be singing out of time or out of tune or singing louder necessarily. But there's a phenomenon in singing known as the singer's formants. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. So it's what opera singers do, where they tune their vocal tract to emphasize certain formants in the vocal spectrum. And this is useful mainly in opera singing, in solo opera singing, because the orchestra, of course, is producing a lot of sound, and the voice has to be heard above it. But it turns out that the spectrum of the orchestral sound has a bit of a gap in it. There's not much energy in this 2,500 to 3,500 hertz region. Okay, and humans are very flexible with the way they engage in vocal production, and you can change the shape of your vocal system to actually emphasize frequencies in that region. And that's what opera singers do to be heard, but it's normally not advised in choral singing, where the emphasis is on blending with the other voices. But it turns out, so here you see some spectrograms of the sopranos, altos, tenors, basses, when females are present versus absent. And what you can see in the bases, okay, these are the oldest boys with the deepest voices. You see this energy in the singer's formant, this hot spot here that's much higher when the girls are present than when they're absent. If I have a minute just to play you just a short 10-second example of each. I'll play absent first. Oh, sorry. Okay, now the girls come in. Ideal conditions to listen to this, but you get the idea. They're singing pretty much the same, but there is this difference. It's reliable. We did a control where we first have just men, we bring the girls in, and then just males again. Okay, and it's published if you want to read about it. However, if we want to understand functions, we've got to see, can people hear this? Is there a sex-related preference to it? This isn't yet published, but we've collected data on an online study where we assess listener sensitivity and preference, and we asked people, we did the preference study first before the other was published and said, here are 2 recordings, which one do you prefer? Which one do you like better? We didn't tell them anything about the manipulation. And the second one, we told them the manipulation and said, there are girls present in one of these performances and just males in the other. Can you pick which is the one with girls? And there we find people can do it reliably above chance, not a big effect, but male and female listeners don't differ. But when you get to preference, females like it reliably more. So you can make of that what you like, okay? It's still in preparation. Okay, so let's conclude. So I've presented something on a theory of ensemble skills that determine how we coordinate with others, and a model that can quantify behavioral parameters that can then be looked at, used to look at what's happening in the brain in terms of supporting this behavior. And what I'd argue is that these individual differences in these skills determine the way we coordinate with others. And this goes on a gradient from basic sensory motor to social influences and sets the scene for effects of music as a way to mediate all of our interactions, and maybe is a ground for developing ways that can then extend outside to situations like we saw in the Christmas truce, and maybe if we ever meet other people from other organisms from other planets. Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful. I'm really looking forward to reading about the peacock effect. This is really what you've demonstrated so nicely. I'm sure there are lots of questions, both online, which I think Katrina will. So do raise your hand online if you have a question. I think we'll start for some questions in here. Kenneth, please.
Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious what you think about group improvisation, especially in the context of things like jazz, where you have a group of seemingly independent musicians, but somehow without knowing anything about what they're going to play in advance, they seem to really get in the zone together and come up with a very cohesive piece.
Yeah, very good question. And I think there's different types of group improvisation. I'm not sure if you're thinking about a completely free situation. A lot of improvisation might have a rhythm section. And you can imagine then that some of the things that I'm talking about would refer to joint attention on the rhythm section, and that would provide a stable basis for maybe interacting around that. Completely free. This sort of approach, maybe what's going on at the level of the brain at some level would be similar, but the sort of modeling approach that I'm talking about, which is very much this rhythmic beat and tempo, that's maybe not so relevant there. And of course, there are other approaches based on dynamical systems theory and so on that use nonlinear oscillator models. This is a linear model, quite straightforward, those equations. We didn't go through them, but you can work through them in your head, actually, not quickly enough to perform, but in theory you can work through them, which means, and it's also very good that you can apply it analytically in real time if you're, for example, human-machine interaction. That's why we're sticking to this linear framework for now. But the nonlinear frameworks, more complex systems, I think is what's needed to describe the completely free, and I think it's been applied in that context as well. There, how that would map onto what's going on in the brain, there, the predictive coding and the sort of thermodynamic principles that are being worked on by here are probably the way to go. But I would add, however, and this is something that we've written about a little bit, is that I think that in all situations, there's a bit of both going on. I think I don't know if it's fanciful to expect that you are completely turning off your knowledge and cognitive processes and thinking about what people might be doing, even in the free case. And likewise, in the case that's scripted, a chamber music context, people playing together like Trio Vandera for 30 years or something like this, they still celebrate spontaneity and do things on the spur of the moment and have to adapt in ways that maybe aren't explained best by this model, because they're picking up subtle cues peripherally with their vision about the other's body motion, continuous motion, and there the other processes go on. So I would say that there's two things going on, and the interesting question is how they're connected.
Eric had a question as well.
Can you go back one slide? Just because it shows a picture of the brain areas that are involved, the kind of interconnectivity areas that are associated with your model.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there are an awful lot of areas there that are indicated. That could either seem to be a real positive finding, or it could be a rather, in a way, a rather disappointing finding. That it's, oh my God, well, the whole brain is involved in this, so what have we learned? I just wonder what you think about the fact that so many brain areas are involved in what you're trying to model.
I think that we have learned that the whole brain is involved in it, but the question is that's kind of the what, but not the how. And I think the important thing that we can't show on these static 2D images, actually, it's patterns of connections between these areas. And this rich club here is something that's actually part of an active flowing state of changing the degree of connectivity between resting state networks that are reconfiguring in real time constantly, differently in different people, it turns out. This is a snapshot. Yeah, or a compressed time. You collapse time and say this is where it's happening, but how it's happening unless you integrate. Yeah.
I had a second question. About anticipation and expectation. I mean, for a while now, I've been sort of troubled by those words and about the relationship between thinking about anticipation or expectation, as other people sometimes call it, versus an idea of readiness. And one of the implications, it seems to me, of words like anticipation and expectation is that some definite thing, some definite state of affairs, perhaps a movement, perhaps a goal or something is actively in mind at that stage.
Yes.
Whereas the notion of readiness is that nothing particular is in mind, but you're in a highly adaptive state. So,
yes.
For instance, if a cricket ball suddenly came crashing through that window, and I happen to be a professional cricketer, an outfielder, I might save my colleague here next to me by putting my hand up the hole.
Yes.
I have no anticipation that was going to happen,
Yes.
but I'm very ready for it and can adapt to it. And I wonder to what extent, therefore, words like anticipation and expectation unnecessarily raise the idea that something particular is in mind, rather than that we're just highly ready for whatever it is that's going to happen.
Right. Yes, the specific words used can be discussed. Those are terms that we've been using consistently for a while and haven't really had much reason to change it. But I think the point you're getting at is totally valid, and I think there are three levels. One is this state of readiness, which I would say, in terms of manifestation, neurophysiologically, would be change in kind of tonic activity, sort of baseline or the state or state of functional connectivity, sort of biasing towards outside of maybe this being between states towards one particular state, but just a bias, not kind of fully going there, but ready to tip if some external information triggers a full-scale switch. You're by definition ready to make that transition a bit faster than otherwise. That's a sort of tonic state, it's sort of extended in time, overall shift in the baseline of connectivity. And then we have, as in the model, this the mimicking, which I'm calling perseveration. You could think about that happening. That's probably something happening that's even at auditory cortex. So we have this distinction between what's happening in the motor system and the auditory system, and these are tightly connected in humans, of course. So they're sharing the information, but the expectations can maybe be, if you accept the terms bottom up and top down, are the sort of bottom up expectancies, and you see these in mismatch negativities in EEG, for example, in event-related potentials. Whereas the anticipation is where the motor system is engaged and requires maybe a bit more intention to go along. It can still be automated in expertise, but it's more internally driven, more endogenous is the way I see it. So, and that's what I'm bundling anticipation, those two things together, the temporal predictions and the expectancies. So that's what I'll do if I was writing it down in the talk. I don't go into that nuance, but you've added a third dimension, which is this readiness, which I see as a more tonic state of the system that's more extended in time than these effects, which are more local.
Do we have any questions online? We not. Leonardo, please.
Thank you very much for your fantastic talk. You showed very solid evidence to think about the neuroanalysis involved in all these processes of synchronization, and also some evidence about power in different oscillations. And I wonder, what is the interaction that you could expect from different brain regions, how they communicate or how they are connected functionally, and different frequency bands, for instance?
Indeed, that's an important question, and we've collected data to address this. In fact, with the same participants, the 75 participants who did the MRI study, 40 of them came back to do EEG. The others didn't want to have anything else to do with us ever again. Not really. But we could only, by the time we got our act together and could do the EEG. And the idea is, yes, now that we've identified the networks and that are coupled together, we want to understand how the communication is taking place and actually, use this. And we have anatomical scans as well, so we can do fairly good source estimation with the EEG data. And we have higher density than in some of the other studies I presented. And we have, of course, hypotheses about which frequency bands might be relevant. Some of those guided by the studies where we just focused on single frequency bands. And in the meantime, there's a big literature on temporal predictions, beat-based predictions, and modulations of beta power, for example, in an anticipatory fashion just before. But there are other things. So the integration aspect, that's where our alpha power seems to be suggestive. There's other work, on attention and integration that spans gamma and theta. So what I'm thinking, the idea, and I don't want to go too much into detail before doing the analysis, but where it's going to get really interesting is not just the power or the coherence in particular frequency bands. The idea of the study was to measure that and see how it's correlated with individual differences based on our model parameters and just map one onto the other. But now that I've been thinking about it a bit more and fully process these MRI studies, which we just submitted the second revision of a week ago or something, so my head is more in that space, I think it's going to be cross-frequency band coupling where things are actually going on. And I haven't fully mapped out the hypotheses. I will before I analyze the data. We're just pre-processing the data now.
If I can, then we'll have another question. I was just wondering about, because of course, all of this is finger tapping and it's strumming and so on, but I know one of your great interests is also in dancing.
Yes.
And of course, you are co-supervising students who are doing this. And I was wondering whether you wanted to speak to how it is that you see your model, how Adam fits with Eve, how it makes us want to dance.
Yes, well, and actually there is an Adam and Eve, where the Eve is the evolutionary emergent approach, which is the sort of the ecological or evolutionary and emergent approach, which is the continuous dynamics. And that's in response to Kenneth's question. That will be a matter of linking those together, because again, I think there are discrete elements, the footsteps in dance or other movements, landmarks. As you know, I'm not at all a dancer, but I know that, in ballroom dancing and in ways of codifying dance, there are certain poses. So these can be thought of, in movie terms, they would be called keyframes. Like if you have cartoonists, they have certain sketches and they have to fill in the bits before it. Exactly. So that's what, at least before things are automated, that's where Adam can come into play with these discrete, deals with discrete events. These are tone onsets. I can add as a side note, one may be concerned, okay, but what if they're not periodic and beat-based? Well, firstly, the tempo change, it's made to do tempo changes, but more complex rhythms where you have variable durations. How does it handle that? Well, it turns out that it's surprisingly robust, even for somebody who was involved in producing it. It still surprises me with these things. So we applied it to data from seal pups focalizing. So our colleague, Andrea Ravignani, who's now partly in Aarhus, also in Nijmegen, he has seal pup data of pups interacting with one another. So these are orphaned seal pups in an enclosure, or with he's done playback experiments. And when we apply the Adam model, we can get sensible things. Okay, I'm saying sensible things. I'm cautious about interpreting it in light of human behavior, because that's a little bit, that would be a bit questionable in this case. But what I mean by sensible things, when you compare interacting with a real seal pup or with a playback experiment where you play the same sequence of playback over and over again, you find evidence where there's less and less, there's some evidence for adaptation at the start, and it decays as they presumably habituate and realize it's not and interact. Presumably, again, I'm doing air quotes because I don't know what they're really doing, but it looks as if it's like infant studies where you have the still face or the video of the mother, and the infant can become disinterested or even distressed if once it's not interactive in real time. And the seal pups, the Adam model seems to reveal that, and other methods haven't done that. And we have a paper that's just been accepted on that topic. So I'm confident that more ground can be achieved with this model, even in more complex situations such as dance. But you're absolutely right, it needs the Eve part, it needs the continuous dynamics somehow supporting it. And in that case, it's going to be, at some level, it constrains what's happening. But the way I think about it is that if somebody is thinking about particular steps, it's like a scaffold, and the continuous dynamics kind of hang on that scaffold, right? But sometimes there'll be a strong wind or some external forces that are going to make the scaffold maybe have to change its structure.
But then, of course, the follow-up question is how sin came into the world, and Eva came together. And why does it feel so good? You know, why is it that actually dancing together to do these things in time in the group? Why is that so powerful? And of course, it's a central question to this center.
Well, that's where what you mentioned before about group. So. It turns out a lot of the systems that are controlling this, these timing circuits are also involved in reward, in the basal ganglia. And this is where conditions such as Parkinson's disease come into play as well, where music stimulating these systems has gains in terms of, for example, gait rehabilitation and so on.
You worked on Parkinson's as well in dancing.
Yes, and what we're interested in, why do some patients, so one of the techniques with Parkinson's, there's obviously dance for Parkinson's, and also just even more basic rhythmic auditory stimulation, RAS, there's even an acronym, where if you ask patients to walk with an external metronome or with music, with a clear beat, for many of them it helps them initiate movement and move with larger step length and less variable. So it alleviates some of the gait symptoms. But the issue is, well, I don't know how far it's gone. I guess there's always superstars at any sort of endeavor. But what I think is the case, like there seems to be gains in classic work that I've seen going back over 20 years. The plots show individual patients, and each one, after several weeks, months of therapy, has a gain, but some of the gains are pretty minuscule and some are huge. Now, the question would be, do you want to give everybody the same therapy? Would it be good to know if you could predict how much gain they're likely to have, and maybe have alternative therapies and see what sort of do it for a while and see what seems to be working the best, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And there we find that if you do these synchronization tasks, using a movement which they don't have any trouble with, okay, you can assess. For example, it turns out that the error correction capacities are a pretty decent predictor of the outcome of 14 weeks of gait rehabilitation, listening to a German folk song, which I wish I had the slide here. I'd play it to you. It's quite people self-select the music.
We should discuss more, because of course, again, it's wonderful if we can use this basic knowledge to really get a handle on what is the right kind of therapy for people that clearly are missing flourishing.
Yeah. Well, another aspect of the rewarding is linking to the social bonding is oxytocin has been implicated in these. And I think it's one of these things that is maybe at a neurochemical level involved in regulating this metastability in the brain, actually.
Of course, it depends on whether you like people or not, right? Whether the in or the out group, as we know from the animal.
Well, that's where all these other factors and the social factors and knowledge and beliefs come into it.
Oh, great. There's a question in the back, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't want to be a crime question, but it's sort of still, I'm trying to maybe, as I will be speaking, it will come to me. And I'm not even sure whether it will be able to answer it, but I do find my relating more to the shamans that you were talking about in the study of that. But I come more from, so you were talking mostly about people who are creating music. What about people who actually listen to music? And for me, it will be more of an interesting way to see, I think, kind of mass influence. It probably is kind of hard to study, but I would like to hear your opinion on the influence of music on kind of the crowd mentality. Maybe if we're talking about like a huge concerts, because we know definitely how music can be hypnotic, and how people sort of behaving like one organism. And I wonder we also know, have information about, for example, music being used to make people behave in a specific manner. For example, we do know where is the word, there are fine lines, there always were some sort of a musician or someone who would be whether with drums or something, to actually motivate people to kind of do certain, specific actions. How about if we look the opposite direction, which we look about pro-social behavior? So I wonder about the pro-social behavior of that and kind of the crowd mentality, whether it's possible to influence maybe about the way synchronicity is that it was possible to study, and also the long-term effects of those.
Yes. I mean, there have been steps to address various components of that. Of course, there's some technical challenges in terms of getting precise and good signal-to-noise ratio in these very ecological contexts, in terms of if you're recording brain processes, for example, and even movements. But there are more and more labs being established where the resources are there to do that. Studies done at in rave situations and all sorts of contexts. The issue there is that one can generate a lot of data, often from maybe one event or a subset of participants at an event, and sometimes it's from what I can tell, it's sometimes hard to interpret very decisively what's actually going on and make sense of it, or even do appropriate statistics on it. However, that said, clearly, what we know from the lab studies, there's certainly enough hypotheses to generalize. So in terms of, you use the example of using music in a military situation, and of course there's a lot of kind of, William McNeill, historical book on the use of drill in military contexts throughout history is a quite a well-known example, and there really kind of deconstructs what's going on. And so one of the functions, which doesn't necessarily come up in that list of ritual functions, is to coordinate large groups of people. So music and drumming in particular has been used for a long time to do that. Now, how it works, if it's just an external signal that functions as a kind of template or target points at which to coordinate, is one thing. But we also know that music, at least in these contexts that you're describing, we mustn't forget that it's also constructed in such a way to modulate mood and emotions. So there's that component as well. Here, as you rightly pointed out, I'm mainly focusing on the mechanics of action and so on, but there's the emotional component and the mood component as well. On top of that, there's another layer. If somebody does go to a concert of a band, they have certain expectations. We were talking about readiness before. You go there, there's a bit of a ritual before you go out in terms of preparing for it. You're very eager, your mood is at a certain point, and so on. So maybe all these factors have to conspire together to produce the most powerful effects, I would say. That's, I think, also why some of these rituals that go on, many of them, if not most, aren't just like, let's pop up, get this ritual out of the way in half an hour and go home. Some of them go for days and days and weeks and build up, and the full effects do take a while. So that makes it hard to study as well. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer your question, other than to say that I think we have the ingredients to understand what's going on in these things, but to demonstrate how it works when it's put together is not so tractable.
Well, there's maybe an anticipation in this room about having coffee and chocolates and
I sense it too, yes, yes.
So I think we should thank you for this wonderful talk.